I should have known, I said, my eyes still fixed on that painting. Then you must stay away. Celeste has a great deal of power, being one of the oldest, and she is jealous of the child's beauty. And Santiago, as you can see, is only waiting for a shred of proof that you're outlaws. I turned slowly and looked at him again where he sat with that eerie vampire stillness, as if he were in fact not alive at all. The moment lengthened. I heard his words just as if he were speaking them again. All I want here is a certain space, a certain peace, or not to be here at all. And I felt a longing for him so strong that it took all my strength to contain it, merely to sit there gazing at him, fighting it. I wanted it to be this way. Claudia, safe amongst these vampires somehow, guilty of no crime they might ever discover from her or anyone else, so that I might be free, free to remain forever in this cell, as long as I could be welcome, even tolerated, allowed here on any condition whatsoever. I could see that mortal boy again, as if he were not asleep on the bed, but kneeling at Armand's side with his arms around Armand's neck. It was an icon for me of love. The love I felt, not physical love, you must understand. I don't speak of that at all, though Armand was beautiful and simple, and no intimacy with him would ever have been repellent. For vampires, physical love culminates and is satisfied in one thing, the kill. I speak of another kind of love which drew me to him completely, as the teacher which Lestat had never been. Knowledge would never be withheld by Armand, I knew it. I would pass through him as through a pane of glass, so that I might bask in it and absorb it and grow. I shut my eyes and I thought I heard him speak. So faintly I wasn't certain. It seemed he said, "Do you know why I am here?" I looked up at him again, wondering if he knew my thoughts, could actually read them, if such could conceivably be the extent of that power. Now, after all these years, I could forgive Lestat for being nothing but an ordinary creature who could not show me the uses of my powers. And yet I still longed for this, could fall into it without resistance. A sadness pervaded it all, sadness for my own weakness and my own awful dilemma. Claudia waited for me, Claudia who was my daughter and my love. "What am I to do?" I whispered. "Go away from them? Go away from you after all these years?" "They don't matter to you," he said. I smiled and nodded. "What is it you want to do?" he asked, and his voice assumed the most gentle, sympathetic tone. "Don't you know? Don't you have that power?" I asked. "Can't you read my thoughts as if they were words?" He shook his head. "Not the way you mean. I only know the danger to you, and the child is real because it's real to you. And I know your loneliness, even with her love, is almost more terrible than you can bear." I stood up then. It would seem a simple thing to do, to rise, to go to the door, to hurry quickly down that passage, and yet it took every ounce of strength, every smattering of that curious thing I've called my detachment. "I ask you to keep them away from us," I said at the door, but I couldn't look back at him, didn't even want the soft intrusion of his voice. "Don't go," he said. "I have no choice." I was in the passage when I heard him so close to me that I started. He stood beside me, eye level with my eye, and in his hand he held a key which he pressed into mine. "There is a door there," he said, gesturing to the dark end, which I thought to be merely a wall, and a stairs to the side street which no one uses but myself. "Go this way now so you can avoid the others. You are anxious, and they will see it." I turned around to go at once, though every part of my being wanted to remain there. "But let me tell you this," he said, and lightly he pressed the back of his hand against my heart. "Use the power inside you. Don't abhor it anymore. Use that power. And when they see you in the streets above, use that power to make your face a mask and think as you gaze on them, as on anyone, beware. Take that word as if it were an amulet I'd given you to wear about your neck. And when your eyes meet Santiago's eyes or the eyes of any other vampire, speak to them politely what you will, but think of that word and that word only. Remember what I say. I speak to you simply because you respect what is simple. You understand this. That's your strength." I took the key from him, and I don't remember actually putting it into the lock or going up the steps or where he was or what he'd done, except that, as I was stepping into the dark side street behind the theater, I heard him say very softly to me from some place close to me, "Come here, to me, when you can." I looked around for him, but was not surprised that I couldn't see him. He had told me also some time or other that I must not leave the Hotel St. Gabriel, that I must not give the others the shred of evidence of guilt they wanted. "You see," he said, "killing other vampires is very exciting. That is why it is forbidden under penalty of death." And then I seemed to awake, to the Paris street shining with rain, to the tall narrow buildings on either side of me, to the fact that the door had shut to make a solid dark wall behind me, and that Armand was no longer there. And though I knew Claudia waited for me, though I passed her in the hotel window, above the gas lamps, a tiny figure standing among waxen-petaled flowers, I moved away from the boulevard, letting the darker streets swallow me, as so often the streets of New Orleans had done. It was not that I did not love her, rather it was that I knew I loved her only too well, that the passion for her was as great as the passion for Armand. And I fled them both now, letting the desire for the kill rise in me like a welcome fever, threatening consciousness, threatening pain. Out of the mist which had followed the rain, a man was walking towards me. I can remember him as roaming on the landscape of a dream, because the night around me was dark and unreal. The hill might have been anywhere in the world, and the soft lights of Paris were an amorphous shimmering in the fog, and sharp-eyed and drunk he was walking blindly into the arms of death itself, his pulsing fingers reaching out to touch the very bones of my face. I was not crazed yet, not desperate. I might have said to him, "Pass by." I believe my lips did form the word Armand had given me, "Beware," yet I let him slip his bold, drunken arm around my waist. I yielded to his adoring eyes, to the voice that begged to paint me now, and spoke of warmth, to the rich, sweet smell of the oils that streaked his loose shirt. I was following him through Montmartre, and I whispered to him, "You are not a member of the dead." He was leading me through an overgrown garden, through the sweet, wet grasses, and he was laughing as I said, "Alive, alive," his hand touching my cheek, stroking my face, clasping finally my chin as he guided me into the light of the low doorway, his reddened face brilliantly illuminated by the oil lamps, the warmth seeping about us as the door closed. I saw the great sparkling orbs of his eyes, the tiny red veins that reached for the dark centers, that warm hand burning my cold hunger as he guided me to a chair. And then all around me I saw faces blazing, faces rising in the smoke of the lamps, in the shimmer of the burning stove, a wonderland of colors, on canvases surrounding us beneath the small sloped roof, a blaze of beauty that pulsed and throbbed. Sit down," he said to me, those feverish hands against my chest, clasped by my hands, yet sliding away, my hunger rising in waves. And now I saw him at a distance, eyes intent, the palette in his hand, the huge canvas obscuring the arm that moved. And mindless and helpless I sat there drifting with his paintings, drifting with those adoring eyes, letting it go on and on till Armand's eyes were gone, and Claudia was running down that stone passage with clicking heels away from me, away from me. "You are alive," I whispered. "Bones," he answered me, "bones." And I saw them in heaps taken from those shallow graves of New Orleans, as they are, and put in chambers behind the sepulchre, so that another can be laid in that narrow plot. I felt my eyes close. I felt my hunger become agony, my heart crying out for a living heart. And then I felt him moving forward, hands out to right my face, that fatal step, that fatal lurch. A sigh escaped my lips. "Save yourself," I whispered to him. "Beware." And then something happened in the moist radiance of his face. Something drained the broken vessels of his fragile skin. He backed away from me, the brush falling from his hands, and I rose over him, feeling my teeth against my lip, feeling my eyes fill with the colors of his face, my ears fill with his struggling cry, my hands fill with that strong, fighting flesh, until I drew him up to me, helpless, and tore that flesh and had the blood that gave it life. "Die," I whispered when I held him loose now. His head bowed against my coat. "Die," and felt him struggle to look up at me. And again I drank, and again he fought, until at last he slipped, limp and shocked and near to death on the floor, yet his eyes did not close. I settled before his canvas, weak, at peace, gazing down at him, at his vague, graying eyes. My own hands florid, my skin so luxuriously warm. I am mortal again, I whispered to him. I am alive. With your blood, I am alive. His eyes closed. I sank back against the wall and found myself gazing at my own face. A sketch was all he'd done, a series of bold black lines that nevertheless made up my face and shoulders perfectly, and the color was already begun in dabs and splashes, the green of my eyes, the white of my cheek, but the horror of seeing my expression, for he had captured it perfectly, and there was nothing of horror in it. Those green eyes gazed at me from out of that loosely drawn shape with a mindless innocence, the expressionless wonder of that overpowering craving, which he had not understood. Louis of 100 years ago, lost in listening to the sermon of the priest at Mass, lips parted and slack hair careless, a hand curved in the lap and limp. A mortal Louis, I believe I was laughing, putting my hands to my face, and laughing so that the tears nearly rose in my eyes, and when I took my fingers down there was the stain of the tears, tinged with mortal blood, and already there was begun in me the tingling of the monster that had killed, and would kill again, who was gathering up the painting now and starting to flee with it from the small house. When suddenly, up from the floor, the man rose with an animal groan, and clutched at my boot, his hand sliding off the leather. With some colossal spirit that defied me, he reached up for the painting, and held fast to it with his whitening hands. "Give it back," he growled at me. "Give it back." And we held fast, the two of us, I staring at him, and at my own hands that held so easily what he sought so desperately to rescue, as if he would take it to heaven or hell. I, the thing that his blood could not make human, he the man that my evil had not overcome, and then, as if I were not myself, I tore the painting loose from him, and wrenching him up to my lips with one arm, gashed his throat in rage. Entering the rooms of the Hotel St. Gabriel, I set the picture on the mantel above the fire, and looked at it a long time. Claudia was somewhere in the rooms, and some other presence intruded, as though on one of the balconies above a woman or a man stood near, giving off an unmistakable personal perfume. I didn't know why I had taken the picture, why I'd fought for it, so that it shamed me now worse than the death, and why I still held onto it at the marble mantel, my head bowed, my hands visibly trembling, and then slowly I turned my head. I wanted the rooms to take shape around me. I wanted the flowers, the velvet, the candles in their sconces, to be mortal and trivial and safe. And then, as if in a mist, I saw a woman there. She was seated calmly at that lavish table where Claudia attended to her hair, and so still she sat, so utterly without fear, her green taffeta sleeves reflected in the tilted mirrors, her skirts reflected that she was not one still woman but a gathering of women. Her dark red hair was parted in the middle and drawn back to her ears, though a dozen little ringlets escaped to make a frame for her pale face. And she was looking at me with two calm violet eyes and a child's mouth that seemed almost obdurately soft, obdurately the Cupid's bow unsullied by paint or personality, and the mouth smiled now and said, as those eyes seemed to fire, "Yes, he's as you said he would be, and I love him already. He's as you said." She rose now, gently lifting that abundance of dark taffeta, and the three small mirrors emptied at once. And utterly baffled and almost incapable of speech, I turned to see Claudia far off on the immense bed, her small face rigidly calm, though she clung to the silk curtain with a tight fist. "Madeleine," she said under her breath, "Louis is shy." And she watched with cold eyes as Madeleine only smiled when she said this, and drawing closer to me, put both of her hands to the lace fringe around her throat, moving it back so I could see the two small marks there. Then the smile died on her lips, and they became at once sullen and sensual as her eyes narrowed and she breathed the word drink. I turned away from her, my fists rising in a consternation for which I couldn't find words, but then Claudia had hold of that fist and was looking up at me with relentless eyes. "Do it, Louis," she commanded, "because I cannot do it." Her voice was painfully calm, all the emotion under the hard, measured tone. "I haven't the size. I haven't the strength. You saw to that when you made me. Do it." I broke away from her, clutching my wrist as if she'd burned it. I could see the door, and it seemed to me the better part of wisdom to leave it by at once. I could feel Claudia's strength, her will, and the mortal woman's eyes seemed afire with that same will. But Claudia held me. not with a gentle pleading, a miserable coaxing that would have dissipated that power, making me feel pity for her as I gathered my own forces. She held me with the emotion her eyes had evinced, even through her coldness and the way that she turned away from me now, almost as if she'd been instantly defeated. I did not understand the manner in which she sank back on the bed, her head bowed, her lips moving feverishly, her eyes rising only to scan the walls. I wanted to touch her and say to her that what she asked was impossible. I wanted to soothe that fire that seemed to be consuming her from within. And the soft, mortal woman had settled into one of the velvet chairs by the fire, with the rustling and iridescence of her taffeta dress surrounding her, like part of the mystery of her dispassionate eyes which watched us now, the fever of her pale face. I remember turning to her, spurred on by that childish, pouting mouth set against the fragile face. The vampire kiss had left no visible trace except the wound, no inalterable change on the pale pink flesh. "How do we appear to you?" I asked, seeing her eyes on Claudia. She seemed excited by the diminutive beauty. The awful woman's passion knotted in the small, dimpled hands. She broke her gaze and looked up at me. "I ask you, how do we appear? Do you think us beautiful, magical, our white skin, our fierce eyes? Oh, I remember perfectly what mortal vision was, the dimness of it, and how the vampire's beauty burned through that veil. So powerfully alluring, so utterly deceiving. Drink, you tell me. You haven't the vaguest conception under God of what you ask." But Claudia rose from the bed and came towards me. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you make this decision for both of us? Do you know how I despise you? Do you know that I despise you with a passion that eats at me like a canker?" Her small form trembled, her hands hovering over the pleated bodice of her yellow gown. "Don't you look away from me. I am sick at heart with your looking away, with your suffering. You understand nothing. Your evil is that you cannot be evil, and I must suffer for it. I tell you, I will suffer no longer." Her fingers bit into the flesh of my wrist. I twisted, stepping back from her, foundering in the face of the hatred, the rage rising like some dormant beast in her, looking out through her eyes, snatching me from my mortal hands, like two grim monsters in a nightmare fairy tale. "You idle, blind parents, fathers," she spat the word. "Let tears gather in your eyes. You haven't tears enough for what you've done to me. 6 more mortal years, 7, 8, I might have had that shape." Her pointed finger flew at Madeleine, whose hands had risen to her face, whose eyes were clouded over. Her moan was almost Claudia's name, but Claudia did not hear her. "Yes, that shape. I might have known what it was to walk at your side. Monsters! To give me immortality in this hopeless guise, this helpless form?" The tears stood in her eyes. The words had died away, drawn in as it were on her breast. "Now, you give her to me," she said, her head bowing, her curls tumbling down to make a concealing veil. "You give her to me. You do this, or you finish what you did to me that night in the hotel in New Orleans. I will not live with this hatred any longer. I will not live with this rage. I cannot. I will not abide it." And tossing her hair, she put her hands to her ears, as if to stop the sound of her own words, her breath, drawn in rapid gasps, the tears seeming to scald her cheeks. I had sunk to my knees at her side, and my arms were outstretched as if to enfold her, yet I dared not touch her, dared not even say her name, lest my own pain break from me with the first syllable in a monstrous outpouring of hopelessly inarticulate cries. "Ooh!" She shook her head now, squeezing the tears out onto her cheeks, her teeth clenched tight together. "I love you still, that's the torment of it. Lestat I never loved, but you, the measure of my hatred is that love. They are the same. Do you know now how much I hate you?" She flashed at me through the red film that covered her eyes. "Yes," I whispered. I bowed my head, but she was gone from me into the arms of Madeleine, who enfolded her desperately as if she might protect Claudia from me. The irony of it, the pathetic irony. Protect Claudia from herself. She was whispering to Claudia, "Don't cry. Don't cry," her hand stroking Claudia's face and hair with a fierceness that would have bruised a human child. But Claudia seemed lost against her breast suddenly, her eyes closed, her face smooth, as if all passion were drained away from her, her arms sliding up around Madeleine's neck, her head falling against the taffeta and lace. She lay still, the tears staining her cheeks, as if all this that had risen to the surface had left her weak and desperate for oblivion, as if the room around her, as if I were not there. And there they were together, a tender mortal crying instinctively now, her warm arms holding what she could not possibly understand, this white and fierce and unnatural child thing she believed she loved. And if I had not felt for her, this mad and reckless woman flirting with the damned, if I had not felt all the sorrow for her I felt for my mortal self, I would have wrested the demon thing from her arms, held it tight to me, denying over and over the words I just heard. But I knelt there still, thinking only the love is equal to the hatred, gathering that selfishly to my own breast, holding on to that as I sank back against the bed. A long time before Madeleine was to know it, Claudia had ceased crying and sat still as a statue on Madeleine's lap, her liquid eyes fixed on me, oblivious to the soft red hair that fell around her, or the woman's hand that still stroked her, and I sat slumped against the bedpost, staring back at those vampire eyes, unable and unwilling to speak in my defense. Madeleine was whispering into Claudia's ear. She was letting her tears fall into Claudia's tresses, and then gently Claudia said to her, "Leave us." "No." She shook her head, holding tight to Claudia, and then she shut her eyes and trembled all over with some terrible vexation, some awful torment. But Claudia was leading her from the chair, and she was now pliant and shocked and white-faced, the green taffeta ballooning around the small yellow silk dress. In the archway of the parlor they stopped, and Madeleine stood as if confused, her hand at her throat beating like a wing, then going still. She looked about her like that hapless victim on the stage of the Théâtre des Vampires, who did not know where she was, but Claudia had gone for something, and I saw her emerge from the shadows with what appeared to be a large doll. I rose on my knees to look at it. It was a doll, the doll of a little girl with raven hair and green eyes, adorned with lace and ribbons, sweet-faced and wide-eyed, its porcelain feet tinkling as Claudia put it into Madeleine's arms. And Madeleine's eyes appeared to harden as she held the doll, and her lips drew back from her teeth in a grimace as she stroked its hair. She was laughing, low under her breath. "Lie down," Claudia said to her, and together they appeared to sink into the cushions of the couch, the green taffeta rustling and giving way as Claudia lay with her and put her arms around her neck. I saw the doll sliding, dropping to the floor, yet Madeleine's hand groped for it and held it dangling, her own head thrown back, her eyes shut tight, and Claudia's curls stroking her face. I settled back on the floor and leaned against the soft siding of the bed. Claudia was speaking now in a low voice, barely above a whisper, telling Madeleine to be patient, to be still. I dreaded the sound of her step on the carpet, the sound of the door sliding closed to shut Madeleine away from us, and the hatred that lay between us like a killing vapor. But when I looked up to her, Claudia was standing there as if transfixed and lost in thought, all rancor and bitterness gone from her face, so that she had the blank expression of that doll. "All you've said to me is true," I said to her. "I deserve your hatred. I've deserved it from those first moments when Lestat put you in my arms." She seemed unaware of me, and her eyes were infused with a soft light. Her beauty burned into my soul so that I could hardly stand it, and then she said, wondering, "You could have killed me then despite him. You could have done it." Then her eyes rested on me calmly. "Do you wish to do it now?" "Do it now?" I put my arm around her, moved her close to me, warmed by her softened voice. "Are you mad to say such things to me? Do I want to do it now?" "I want you to do it," she said. "Bend down now as you did then. Draw the blood out of me, drop by drop. All you have the strength for, push my heart to the brink. I'm small, you can take me, I won't resist you. I'm something frail you can crush like a flower." "You mean these things? You mean what you say to me?" I asked. "Why don't you place the knife here? Why don't you turn it?" "Would you die with me?" she asked, with a sly, mocking smile. "Would you in fact die with me?" she pressed. "Don't you understand what is happening to me, that he's killing me, that master vampire who has you in thrall, that he won't share your love with me, not a drop of it? I see his power in your eyes. I see your misery, your distress. The love for him you can't hide. Turn around. I'll make you look at me with those eyes that want him. I'll make you listen." "Don't any more, don't. I won't leave you. I've sworn to you, don't you see? I cannot give you that woman." But I'm fighting for my life. Give her to me so she can care for me. Complete the guise I must have to live. And he can have you then. I'm fighting for my life. I all but shoved her off. No, it's madness, it's witchery, I said, trying to defy her. It's you who will not share me with him. It's you who want every drop of that love, if not from me, from her. He overpowers you. He disregards you. And it's you who wish him dead the way that you killed Lestat. Well, you won't make me a party to this death, I tell you. Not this death. I will not make her one of us. I will not damn the legions of mortals who will die at her hands if I do. Your power over me is broken. I will not. Oh, if she could only have understood. Not for a moment could I truly believe her words against Armand, that out of that detachment, which was beyond revenge, he could selfishly wish for her death. But that was nothing to me now. Something far more terrible than I could grasp was happening, something I was only beginning to understand, against which my anger was nothing but a mockery, a hollow attempt to oppose her tenacious will. She hated me, she loathed me, as she herself had confessed, and my heart shriveled inside me as if in depriving me of that love which had sustained me a lifetime she had dealt me a mortal blow. The knife was there. I was dying for her, dying for that love as I was that very first night when Lestat gave her to me, turned her eyes to me and told her my name, that love which had warmed me in my self-hatred, allowed me to exist. Oh, how Lestat had understood it, and now at last his plan was undone. But it went beyond that, in some region from which I was shrinking as I strode back and forth, my hands opening and closing at my sides, feeling not only that hatred in her liquid eyes. It was her pain. She had shown me her pain. To give me immortality in this hopeless guise, this helpless form. I put my hands to my ears as if she spoke the words yet, and the tears flowed. For all these years I had depended utterly upon her cruelty, her absolute lack of pain. And pain was what she showed to me, undeniable pain, and how Lestat would have laughed at us. That was why she had put the knife to him, because he would have laughed. To destroy me utterly, she need only show me that pain. The child I made a vampire suffered. Her agony was as my own. There was a coffin in that other room, a bed for Madeleine, to which Claudia retreated, to leave me alone with what I could not abide. I welcomed the silence, and sometime during the few hours that remained of the night I found myself at the open window, feeling the slow mist of the rain. It glistened on the fronds of the ferns, on sweet white flowers that listed, bowed and finally broke from their stems, a carpet of flowers littering the little balcony, the petals pounded softly by the rain. I felt weak now and utterly alone. What had passed between us tonight could never be undone, and what had been done to Claudia by me could never be undone. But I was somehow, to my own bewilderment, empty of all regret. Perhaps it was the night, the starless sky, the gas lamps frozen in the mist, that gave some strange comfort for which I never asked, and didn't know how, in this emptiness and aloneness, to receive. I am alone, I was thinking, I am alone. It seemed just perfectly, and so to have a pleasing and inevitable form, and I pictured myself then forever alone, as if on gaining that vampire strength, the night of my death I had left Lestat and never looked back for him, as I had moved on away from him beyond the need of him and anyone else, as if the night had said to me, "You are the night, and the night alone understands you and enfolds you in its arms, one with the shadows, without nightmare and inexplicable peace." Yet I could feel the end of this peace as surely as I'd felt my brief surrender to it, and it was breaking like the dark clouds. The urgent pain of Claudia's loss pressed in on me, behind me, like a shape gathered from the corners of this cluttered and oddly alien room. But outside, even as the night seemed to dissolve in a fierce driving wind, I could feel something calling to me, something inanimate which I'd never known, and a power within me seemed to answer that power, not with resistance, but with an inscrutable, chilling strength. I moved silently through the rooms, gently dividing the doors, until I saw, in the dim light cast by the flickering gas flames behind me, that sleeping woman, lying in my shadow on the couch, the doll limp against her breast. Some time before I knelt at her side, I saw her eyes open, and I could feel beyond her, in the collected dark, those other eyes watching me, that breathless tiny vampire face waiting. "Will you care for her, Madeleine?" I saw her hands clutch at the doll, turning its face against her breast. and my own hand went out for it, though I did not know why, even as she was answering me. "Yes," she repeated it again desperately. "Is this what you believe her to be, a doll?" I asked her, my hand closing on the doll's head, only to feel her snatch it away from me, see her teeth clenched as she glared at me. "A child who can't die. That's what she is," she said, as if she were pronouncing a curse. "Ah," I whispered. "I've done with dolls," she said, shoving it away from her into the cushions of the couch. She was fumbling with something on her breast, something she wanted me to see and not to see, her fingers catching hold of it and closing over it. I knew what it was, had noticed it before, a locket fixed with a gold pin. I wish I could describe the passion that infected her round features, how her soft baby mouth was distorted. And the child who did die? I guessed, watching her. I was picturing a doll shop, dolls with the same face. She shook her head, her hand pulling hard on the locket, so the pin ripped the taffeta. It was fear I saw in her now, a consuming panic, and her hand bled as she opened it from the broken pin. I took the locket from her fingers. "My daughter," she whispered, her lip trembling. It was a doll's face on the small fragment of porcelain. Claudia's face, a baby face, a saccharine, sweet mockery of innocence. An artist had painted there a child with raven hair like the doll, and the mother, terrified, was staring at the darkness in front of her. "Grief," I said gently. "I've done with grief," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at me. "If you knew how I long to have your power. I'm ready for it. I hunger for it." And she turned to me, breathing deeply so that her breast seemed to swell under her dress. A violent frustration rent her face then. She turned away from me, shaking her head, her curls. "If you were a mortal man and monster," she said angrily, "if I could only show you my power," and she smiled malignantly, defiantly at me, "I could make you want me, desire me, but you're unnatural." Her mouth went down at the corners. "What can I give you? What can I do to make you give me what you have?" Her hand hovered over her breasts, seeming to caress them like a man's hand. It was strange, that moment, strange because I could never have predicted the feeling her words incited in me, the way that I saw her now with that small enticing waist, saw the round plump curve of her breasts, and those delicate pouting lips. She never dreamed what the mortal man in me was, how tormented I was by the blood I'd only just drunk. Desire her I did, more than she knew, because she didn't understand the nature of the kill, and with a man's pride I wanted to prove that to her, to humiliate her for what she had said to me, for the cheap vanity of her provocation. And the eyes that looked away from me now in disgust. But this was madness. These were not the reasons to grant eternal life. And cruelly surely I said to her, "Did you love this child?" I will never forget her face then, the violence in her, the absolute hatred. "Yes." She all but hissed the words at me. "How dare you?" She reached for the locket even as I clutched it. It was guilt that was consuming her, not love. It was guilt. That shop of dolls Claudia had described to me, shelves and shelves of the effigy of that dead child, but guilt that absolutely understood the finality of death. There was something as hard in her as the evil in myself, something as powerful. She had her hand out towards me. She touched my waistcoat and opened her fingers there, pressing them against my chest. And I was on my knees, drawing close to her, her hair brushing my face. "Hold fast to me when I take you," I said to her, seeing her eyes grow wide, her mouth open, "and when the swoon is strongest, listen all the harder for the beating of my heart. Hold and say over and over, 'I will live.' Yes, yes," she was nodding, her heart pounding with her excitement. Her hands burned on my neck, fingers forcing their way into my collar. "Look beyond me at that distant light. Don't take your eyes off of it, not for a second, and say over and over, 'I will live.'" She gasped as I broke the flesh, the worn current coming into me, her breast crushed against me, her body arching up, helpless from the couch. And I could see her eyes, even as I shut my own, see that taunting, provocative mouth. I was drawing on her hard, lifting her, and I could feel her weakening, her hands dropping limp at her sides. "Tight, tight," I whispered over the hot stream of her blood, her heart thundering in my ears, her blood swelling my satiated veins. "The lamp," I whispered, "look at it." Her heart was slowing, stopping, and her head dropped back from me on the velvet, her eyes dull to the point of death. It seemed for a moment I couldn't move, yet I knew I had to. that someone else was lifting my wrist to my mouth as the room turned round and round, that I was focusing on that light as I had told her to do, as I tasted my own blood from my own wrist, and then forced it into her mouth. "Drink it, drink," I said to her, but she lay as if dead. I gathered her close to me, the blood pouring over her lips. Then she opened her eyes and I felt the gentle pressure of her mouth, and then her hands closing tight on the arm as she began to suck. I was rocking her, whispering to her, trying desperately to break my swoon, and then I felt her powerful pull. Every blood vessel felt it. I was threaded through and through with her pulling. My hand holding fast to the couch now, her heart beating fierce against my heart, her fingers digging deep into my arm, my outstretched palm. It was cutting me, scoring me, so I all but cried out as it went on, and I was backing away from her, yet pulling her with me. My life passing through my arm, her moaning breath in time with her pulling, and those strings which were my veins, those searing wires pulled at my very heart harder and harder until, without will or direction, I had wrenched free of her and fallen away from her, clutching that bleeding wrist tight with my own hand. She was staring at me, the blood staining her open mouth. An eternity seemed to pass as she stared. She doubled and tripled in my blurred vision, then collapsed into one trembling shape. Her hand moved to her mouth, yet her eyes did not move, but grew large in her face as she stared. And then she rose slowly, not as if by her own power, but as if lifted from the couch bodily by some invisible force which held her now, staring as she turned round and round, her massive skirt moving stiff, as if she were all of a piece, turning like some great carved ornament on a music box that dances helplessly round and round to the music. And suddenly she was staring down at the taffeta, grabbing hold of it, pressing it between her fingers so it zinged and rustled, and she let it fall quickly, covering her ears, her eyes shut tight, then opened wide again. And then it seemed she saw the lamp, the distant low gas lamp of the other room that gave a fragile light through the double doors, and she ran to it and stood beside it, watching it as if it were alive. "Don't touch it," Claudia said to her, and gently guided her away. But Madeleine had seen the flowers on the balcony, and she was drawing close to them now, her outstretched palms, brushing the petals and then pressing the droplets of rain to her face. I was hovering on the fringes of the room, watching her every move, how she took the flowers and crushed them in her hands, and let the petals fall all around her, and how she pressed her fingertips to the mirror and stared into her own eyes. My own pain had ceased. A handkerchief bound the wound, and I was waiting, seeing now that Claudia had no knowledge from memory of what was to come next. They were dancing together as Madeleine's skin grew paler and paler in the unsteady golden light. She scooped Claudia into her arms, and Claudia rode round in circles with her, her own small face alert and wary behind her smile. And then Madeleine weakened. She stepped backwards and seemed to lose her balance, but quickly she righted herself and let Claudia go, gently down to the ground. On tiptoe, Claudia embraced her. "Louis," she signaled to me under her breath. "Louis." I beckoned for her to come away, and Madeleine, not seeming even to see us, was staring at her own outstretched hands. Her face was blanched and drawn, and suddenly she was scratching at her lips and staring at the dark stains on her fingertips. "No, no," I cautioned her gently, taking Claudia's hand and holding her close to my side. A long moan escaped Madeleine's lips. "Louis," Claudia whispered in that preternatural voice which Madeleine could not yet hear. "She is dying, which your child's mind can't remember. You were spared it. It left no mark on you," I whispered to her, brushing the hair back from her ear, my eyes never leaving Madeleine, who was wandering from mirror to mirror, the tears flowing freely now, the body giving up its life. "But Louis, if she dies," Claudia cried. "No." I knelt down, seeing the distress in her small face. "The blood was strong enough. She will live, but she will be afraid, terribly afraid." And gently, firmly, I pressed Claudia's hand and kissed her cheek. She looked at me then with mingled wonder and fear, and she watched me with that same expression as I wandered closer to Madeleine, drawn by her cries. She reeled now, her hands out, and I caught her and held her close. Her eyes already burned with unnatural light, a violet fire reflected in her tears. "It's mortal death, only mortal death," I said to her gently. "Do you see the sky? We must leave it now, and you must hold tight to me, lie by my side. A sleep as heavy as death will come over my limbs, and I won't be able to solace you. And you will lie there, and you will struggle with it, But you hold tight to me in the darkness, do you hear? You hold tight to my hands, which will hold your hands as long as I have feeling. She seemed lost for the moment in my gaze, and I sensed the wonder that surrounded her, how the radiance of my eyes was the radiance of all colors, and how all those colors were all the more reflected for her in my eyes. I guided her gently to the coffin, telling her again not to be afraid. When you arise, you will be immortal, I said. No natural cause of death can harm you. Come, lie down. I could see her fear of it, see her shrink from the narrow box. It's satin, no comfort. Already her skin began to glisten, to have that brilliance that Claudia and I shared. I knew now she would not surrender until I lay with her. I held her and looked across the long vista of the room to where Claudia stood, with that strange coffin watching me. Her eyes were still but dark with an undefined suspicion, a cool distrust. I set Madeleine down beside her bed and moved towards those eyes, and kneeling calmly beside her, I gathered Claudia in my arms. Don't you recognize me? I asked her. Don't you know who I am? She looked at me. No, she said. I smiled. I nodded. Bear me no ill will, I said. We are even. At that she moved her head to one side and studied me carefully, then seemed to smile despite herself and to nod in assent. For you see, I said to her in that same calm voice, what died tonight in this room was not that woman. It will take her many nights to die, perhaps years. What has died in this room tonight is the last vestige in me of what was human. A shadow fell over her face clear, as if the composure were rent like a veil, and her lips parted but only with a short intake of breath. Then she said, well, then you are right. Indeed, we are even. I want to burn the doll shop. Madeleine told us this. She was feeding to the fire in the grate the folded dresses of that dead daughter, white lace and beige linen, crinkled shoes, bonnets that smelled of camphor balls and sachet. It means nothing now, any of it. She stood back watching the fire blaze, and she looked at Claudia with triumphant, fiercely devoted eyes. I did not believe her, so certain I was. Even though night after night I had to lead her away from men and women she could no longer drain dry. So satiated was she with the blood of earlier kills, often lifting her victims off their feet in her passion, crushing their throats with her ivory fingers as surely as she drank their blood. So certain I was that sooner or later this mad intensity must abate, and she would take hold of the trappings of this nightmare, her own luminescent flesh, these lavish rooms of the Hotel St. Gabriel, and cry out to be awakened, to be free. She did not understand it was no experiment, showing her fledgling teeth to the gilt-edged mirrors. She was mad. But I still did not realize how mad she was, and how accustomed to dreaming, and that she would not cry out for reality, rather would feed reality to her dreams. A demon elf feeding her spinning wheel with the reeds of the world, so she might make her own web-like universe. I was just beginning to understand her avarice, her magic. She had a doll-maker's craft from making with her old lover over and over the replica of her dead child, which I was to understand crowded the shelves of this shop we were soon to visit. Added to that was a vampire's skill and a vampire's intensity, so that in the space of one night when I had turned her away from killing, she, with that same insatiable need, created, out of a few sticks of wood with her chisel and knife, a perfect rocking chair, so shaped and proportioned for Claudia that seated in it by the fire she appeared a woman. To that must be added as the nights passed a table of the same scale, and from a toy shop a tiny oil lamp, a china cup and saucer, and from a lady's purse a little leather-bound book for notes, which in Claudia's hands became a large volume. The world crumbled and ceased to exist at the boundary of the small space which soon became the length and breadth of Claudia's dressing room. A bed whose posters reached only to my breast buttons, and small mirrors that reflected only the legs of an unwieldy giant, when I found myself lost among them. Paintings hung low for Claudia's eye, and finally, upon her little vanity table, black evening gloves for tiny fingers, a woman's low-cut gown of midnight velvet, a tiara from a child's masked ball, and Claudia, the crowning jewel, a fairy queen with bare white shoulders, wandering with her sleek tresses among the rich items of her tiny world, while I watched from the doorway, spellbound, ungainly, stretched out on the carpet so I could lean my head on my elbow. and gaze up into my paramour's eyes, seeing them mysteriously softened for the time being by the perfection of this sanctuary. How beautiful she was in black lace, a cold, flaxen-haired woman with a Q-pie doll's face, and liquid eyes which gazed at me so serenely and so long that surely I must have been forgotten. The eyes must be seeing something other than me as I lay there on the floor dreaming, something other than the clumsy universe surrounding me, which was now marked off and nullified by someone who had suffered in it, someone who had suffered always, but who was not seeming to suffer now, listening as it were to the tinkling of a toy music box, putting a hand on the toy clock. I saw a vision of shortened hours and little golden minutes. I felt I was mad. I put my hands under my head and gazed at the chandelier. It was hard to disengage myself from one world and enter the other, and Madeleine on the couch was working, with that regular passion, as if immortality could not conceivably mean rest, sewing cream lace to lavender satin for the small bed, only stopping occasionally to blot the moisture tinged with blood from her white forehead. I wondered if I shut my eyes would this realm of tiny things consume the rooms around me, and would I, like Gulliver, awake to discover myself bound, hand and foot, an unwelcome giant? I had a vision of houses made for Claudia, in whose garden mice would be monsters, and tiny carriages and flowery shrubbery become trees. Mortals would be so entranced and drop to their knees to look into the small windows, like the spider's web it would attract. I was bound hand and foot here, not only by that fairy beauty, that exquisite secret of Claudia's white shoulders, and the rich luster of pearls, bewitching languor, a tiny bottle of perfume, now a decanter from which a spell is released that promises Eden. I was bound by fear that outside these rooms where I supposedly presided over the education of Madeleine, erratic conversations about killing and vampire nature, and which Claudia could have instructed so much more easily than I, if she had ever showed the desire to take the lead, that outside these rooms where nightly I was reassured with soft kisses and contented looks that the hateful passion which Claudia had shown once, and once only, would not return. That outside these rooms I would find that I was, according to my own hasty admission, truly changed. The mortal part of me was that part which had loved, I was certain. So what did I feel then for Armand, the creature for whom I transformed Madeleine, the creature for whom I had wanted to be free? A curious and disturbing distance, a dull pain, a nameless tremor? Even in this worldly clutter, I saw Armand in his monkish cell, saw his dark brown eyes, and felt that eerie magnetism. And yet I did not move to go to him. I did not dare discover the extent of what I might have lost, nor try to separate that loss from some other oppressive realization, that in Europe I'd found no truths to lessen loneliness, transform despair. Rather, I'd found only the inner workings of my own small soul, the pain of Claudia's, and a passion for a vampire who was perhaps more evil than Lestat, for whom I became as evil as Lestat, but in whom I saw the only promise of good in evil of which I could conceive. It was all beyond me finally, and so the clock ticked on the mantel, and Madeleine begged to see the performances of the Théâtre des Vampires, and swore to defend Claudia against any vampire who dared insult her. And Claudia spoke of strategy and said, "Not yet, not now." And I lay back observing with some measure of relief Madeleine's love for Claudia, her blind covetous passion. Oh, I have so little compassion in my heart or memory for Madeleine. I thought she had only seen the first vein of suffering. She had no understanding of death. She was so easily sharpened, so easily driven to wanton violence. I supposed in my colossal conceit and self-deception that my own grief for my dead brother was the only true emotion. I allowed myself to forget how totally I had fallen in love with Lestat's iridescent eyes, that I'd sold my soul for a many-colored and luminescent thing, thinking that a highly reflective surface conveyed the power to walk on water. What would Christ need have done to make me follow him like Matthew or Peter, dress well to begin with, and have a luxurious head of pampered yellow hair? I hated myself, and it seemed, lulled half to sleep as I was so often by their conversation, Claudia whispering of killing and speed and vampire craft, Madeleine bent over her singing needle. It seemed then the only emotion of which I was still capable, hatred of self. I love them. I hate them. I do not care if they are there. Claudia puts her hands on my hair, as if she wants to tell me with the old familiarity that her heart's at peace. I do not care, and there is this apparition of Armand, that power, that heartbreaking clarity, beyond a glass it seems, and taking Claudia's playful hand I understand, for the first time in my life, what she feels when she forgives me for being myself whom, she says, she hates and loves. She feels almost nothing. It was a week before we accompanied Madeleine on her errand to torch a universe of dolls behind a plate glass window. I remember wandering up the street away from it, round a turn into a narrow cavern of darkness, where the falling rain was the only sound, but then I saw the red glare against the clouds. Bells clanged and men shouted, and Claudia, beside me, was talking softly of the nature of fire. The thick smoke rising in that flickering glare unnerved me. I was feeling fear, not a wild, mortal fear, but something cold, like a hook, in my side. This fear, it was the old townhouse bringing in the Rue Royale, Lestat in the attitude of sleep on the burning floor. Fire purifies, Claudia said, and I said no, fire merely destroys. Madeleine had gone past us and was roaming at the top of the street, a phantom in the rain, her white hands whipping the air, beckoning to us white arcs of white fireflies, and I remember Claudia leaving me for her. The sight of wilted, writhing yellow hair, as she told me to follow, a ribbon fallen underfoot, flapping and floating in a swirl of black water. It seemed they were gone, and I bent to retrieve that ribbon. But another hand reached out for it. It was Armand who gave it to me now. I was shocked to see him there, so near, the figure of gentleman death in a doorway, marvelously real in his black cape and silk tie, yet ethereal as the shadows in his stillness. There was the faintest glimmer of the fire in his eyes, red warming the blackness there to the richer brown. And I woke suddenly as if I'd been dreaming, woke to the sense of him, to his hand enclosing mine, to his head inclined as if to let me know he wanted me to follow, awoke to my own excited experience of his presence, which consumed me as surely as it had consumed me in his cell. We were walking together now, fast, nearing the Seine, moving so swiftly and artfully through a gathering of men that they scarce saw us, that we scarce saw them. That I could keep up with him easily amazed me. He was forcing me into some acknowledgement of my powers, that the paths I'd normally chosen were human paths I no longer need follow. I wanted desperately to talk to him, to stop him, with both my hands on his shoulders, merely to look into his eyes again, as I'd done that last night, to fix him in some time and place so that I could deal with the excitement inside me. There was so much I wanted to tell him, so much I wanted to explain, and yet I didn't know what to say or why I would say it, only that the fullness of the feeling continued to relieve me almost to tears. This was what I'd feared lost. I didn't knew where we were now, only that in my wanderings I'd passed here before. A street of ancient mansions, of garden walls and carriage doors and towers, overhead and windows of leaded glass beneath stone arches, houses of other centuries, gnarled trees, that sudden thick and silent tranquility, which means that the masses are shut out. A handful of mortals inhabit this vast region of high-ceilinged rooms. Stone absorbs the sound of breathing, the space of whole lives. Armand was atop a wall now, his arm against the overhanging bough of a tree, his hand reaching for me. And in an instant I stood beside him, the wet foliage brushing any face. Above I could see story after story rising to a lone tower that barely emerged from the dark, teeming rain. Listen to me. We are going to climb to the tower, Armand was saying. I cannot. It's impossible. You don't begin to know your own powers. You can climb easily. Remember, if you fall, you will not be injured. Do as I do, but note this. The inhabitants of this house have known me far 100 years and think me a spirit. So if by chance they see you, or you see them, through those windows, remember what they believe you to be, and show no consciousness of them, lest you disappoint them or confuse them. Do you hear? You are perfectly safe. I wasn't sure what frightened me more, the climb itself or the notion of being seen as a ghost. But I had no time for comforting witticisms, even to myself. Armand had begun, his boots finding the crack between the stones, his hands sure as claws in the crevices, and I was moving after him, tight to the wall, not daring to look down, clinging for a moment's rest to the thick carved arch over a window, glimpsing inside over a licking fire, a dark shoulder, a hand stroking with a poker some figure that moved, completely without knowledge that it was watched. Gone. Higher and higher we climbed until we had reached the window of the tower itself, which Armand quickly wrenched open, his long legs disappearing over the sill, and I rose up after him, feeling his arm out around my shoulders. I sighed despite myself as I stood in the room, rubbing the backs of my arms, looking around this wet, strange place. The rooftops were silver below, turrets rising here and there through the huge, rustling treetops, and far off glimmered the broken chain of a lighted boulevard. The room seemed as damp as the night outside. Armand was making a fire. From a molding pile of furniture he was picking chairs, breaking them into wood easily despite the thickness of their rungs. There was something grotesque about him, sharpened by his grace and the imperturbable calm of his white face. He did what any vampire could do, cracking these thick pieces of wood into splinters, yet he did what only a vampire could do, and there seemed nothing human about him. Even his handsome features and dark hair became the attributes of a terrible angel who shared with the rest of us only a superficial resemblance. The tailored coat was a mirage, and though I felt drawn to him more strongly perhaps than I'd ever been drawn to any living creature save Claudia, he excited me in other ways which resembled fear. I was not surprised that when he finished, he set a heavy oak chair down for me, but retired himself to the marble mantelpiece and sat there warming his hands over the fire, the flames throwing red shadows into his face. "I can hear the inhabitants of the house," I said to him. The warmth was good. I could feel the leather of my boots drying, feel the warmth in my fingers. "Then you know that I can hear them," he said softly, and though this didn't contain a hint of reproach, I realized the implications of my own words. "And if they come?" I insisted, studying him. "Can't you tell by my manner that they won't come?" he asked. "We could sit here all night and never speak of them. I want you to know that if we speak of them, it is because you want to do so." And when I said nothing, and perhaps I looked a little defeated, he said gently that they had long ago sealed off this tower and left it undisturbed, and if in fact they saw the smoke from the chimney or the light in the window, none of them would venture up until tomorrow. I could see now there were several shelves of books at one side of the fireplace, and a writing table. The pages on top were wilted, but there was an inkstand and several pens. I could imagine the room a very comfortable place when it was not storming, as it was now, or after the fire had dried out the air. "You see," Armand said, "you really have no need of the rooms you have at the hotel. You really have need of very little, but each of us must decide how much he wants. These people in this house have a name for me. Encounters with me cause talk for 20 years. They are only isolated instants in my time which mean nothing. They cannot hurt me. And I use their house to be alone. No one of the Théâtre des Vampires knows of my coming here. This is my secret." I had watched him intently as he was speaking, and thoughts which had occurred to me in the cell at the theatre occurred to me again. Vampires do not age, and I wondered how his youthful face and manner might differ now from what he had been a century before, or a century before that, for his face, though not deepened by the lessons of maturity, was certainly no mask. It seemed powerfully expressive, as was his unobtrusive voice, and I was at a loss finally to fully anatomize why. I knew only I was as powerfully drawn to him as before, and to some extent the words I spoke now were a subterfuge. "But what holds you to the Théâtre des Vampires?" I asked. "A need, naturally, but I found what I need," he said. "Why do you shun me?" "I never shunned you," I said, trying to hide the excitement these words produced in me. "You understand, I have to protect Claudia, that she has no one but me. Or at least, she had no one until Madeleine came to live with you?" "Yes," I said, "but now Claudia has released you. Yet still you stay with her and stay bound to her as your paramour, he said. No, she's no paramour of mine. You don't understand, I said. Rather, she's my child, and I don't know that she can release me. These were thoughts I'd gone over and over in my mind. I don't know if the child possesses the power to release the parent. I don't know that I won't be bound to her for as long as she... I stopped. I was going to say for as long as she lives, but I realized it was a hollow, mortal cliché. She would live forever, as I would live forever. But wasn't it so for mortal fathers? Their daughters live forever because these fathers die first? I was at a loss suddenly, but conscious all the while of how Armand listened, that he listened in the way that we dream of others listening, his face seeming to reflect on everything said. He did not start forward to seize on my slightest pause, to a certain understanding of something before the thought was finished, or to argue with a swift, irresistible impulse, the things which often make dialogue impossible. And after a long interval he said, I want you. I want you more than anything in the world. For a moment I doubted what I'd heard. It struck me as unbelievable, and I was hopelessly disarmed by it. And the wordless vision of our living together expanded and obliterated every other consideration in my mind. I said that I want you more than anything in the world, he repeated, with only a subtle change of expression. And then he sat waiting, watching. His face was as tranquil as always, his smooth, white forehead beneath the shock of his auburn hair without a trace of care, his large eyes reflecting on me, his lips still. You want this of me, yet you don't come to me, he said. There are things you want to know, and you don't ask. You see, Claudia is slipping away from you, yet you seem powerless to prevent it, and then you would hasten it, and yet you do nothing. I don't understand my own feelings. Perhaps they are clearer to you than they are to me. You don't begin to know what a mystery you are, he said. But at least you know yourself thoroughly. I can't claim that, I said. I love her, yet I am not close to her. I mean that when I am with you, as I am now, I know that I know nothing of her, nothing of anyone. She's an era for you, an era of your life. If and when you break with her, you break with the only one alive who has shared that time with you. You fear that, the isolation of it, the burden, the scope of eternal life. Yes, that's true, but that's only a small part of it. The era, it doesn't mean much to me. She made it mean something. Other vampires must experience this and survive it, the passing of 100 eras. But they don't survive it, he said. The world would be choked with vampires if they survived it. How do you think I come to be the eldest here, or anywhere, he asked. I thought about this, and then I ventured. They die by violence? No, almost never. It isn't necessary. How many vampires do you think have the stamina for immortality? They have the most dismal notions of immortality to begin with, for in becoming immortal, they want all the forms of their life to be fixed, as they are, and incorruptible, carriages made in the same dependable fashion, clothing of the cut which suited their prime, men attired and speaking in the manner they have always understood and valued, when in fact all things change except the vampire himself. Everything except the vampire is subject to constant corruption and distortion. Soon, with an inflexible mind, and often even with the most flexible mind, this immortality becomes a penitential sentence, in a madhouse of figures and forms that are hopelessly unintelligible and without value. One evening a vampire rises and realizes what he has feared, perhaps for decades, that he simply wants no more of life at any cost, that whatever style or fashion or shape of existence made immortality attractive to him has been swept off the face of the earth, and nothing remains to offer freedom from despair, except the act of killing. And that vampire goes out to die. No one will find his remains, no one will know where he has gone, and often no one around him, should he still seek the company of other vampires. No one will know that he is in despair. He will have ceased long ago to speak of himself, or of anything. He will vanish. I sat back impressed by the obvious truth of it, and yet at the same time, everything in me revolted against that prospect. I became aware of the depth of my hope and my terror. How very different those feelings were from the alienation that he described. How very different from that awful wasting despair. There was something outrageous and repulsive in that despair suddenly. I couldn't accept it. But you wouldn't allow such a state of mind in yourself. Look at you, I found myself answering. If there weren't one single work of art left in this world, and there are thousands, if there weren't a single natural beauty, if the world were reduced to one empty cell and one fragile candle, I can't help but see you studying that candle, absorbed in the flicker of its light, the change of its colors. How long could that sustain you? What possibilities would it create? Am I wrong? Am I such a crazed idealist? No, he said. There was a brief smile on his lips, an evanescent flush of pleasure. But then he went on simply, but you feel an obligation to a world you love because that world for you is still intact. It is conceivable your own sensitivity might become the instrument of madness. You speak of works of art and natural beauty. I wish I had the artist's power to bring alive for you the Venice of the 15th century, my master's palace there, the love I felt for him when I was a mortal boy, and the love he felt for me when he made me a vampire. Oh, if I could make those times come alive, for either you or me, for only an instant, what would that be worth? And what a sadness it is to me that time doesn't dim the memory of that period, that it becomes all the richer and more magical in light of the world I see today. Love? I asked. There was love between you and the vampire who made you? I leaned forward. Yes, he said. A love so strong he couldn't allow me to grow old and die. A love that waited patiently until I was strong enough to be born to darkness. Do you mean to tell me there was no bond of love between you and the vampire who made you? None, I said quickly. I couldn't repress a bitter smile. He studied me. Why then did he give you these powers? He asked. I sat back. You see these powers as a gift, I said. Of course you do, forgive me. But it amazes me how in your complexity you are so profoundly simple, I laughed. Should I be insulted? He smiled. And his whole manner only confirmed in me what I just said. He seemed so innocent. I was only beginning to understand him. No, not by me, I said, my pulse quickening as I looked at him. You're everything I dreamed of when I became a vampire. You see these powers as a gift, I repeated it. But tell me, do you now feel love for this vampire who gave you eternal life? Do you feel this now? He appeared to be thinking, and then he said slowly, Why does this matter? But went on. I don't think I've been fortunate in feeling love for many people or many things, but yes, I love him. Perhaps I do not love him as you mean. It seems you confuse me rather effortlessly. You are a mystery. I do not need him, this vampire, any more. I was gifted with eternal life, with heightened perception, and with the need to kill, I quickly explained, because the vampire who made me wanted the house I owned, and my money. Do you understand such a thing? I asked. Ah, but there is so much else behind what I say. It makes itself known to me so slowly, so incompletely. You see, it's as if you've cracked a door for me, and light is streaming from that door, and I'm yearning to get to it, to push it back, to enter the region you say exists beyond it, when in fact, I don't believe it. The vampire who made me was everything that I truly believed evil to be. He was as dismal, as literal, as barren, as inevitably, eternally disappointing as I believed evil had to be. I know that now, but you are something totally beyond that conception. Open the door for me, push it back all the way. Tell me about this palace in Venice, this love affair with damnation. I want to understand it. You trick yourself. The palace means nothing to you, he said. The doorway you see leads to me now, to your coming to live with me as I am. I am evil with infinite gradations and without guilt. Yes, exactly, I murmured. And this makes you unhappy, he said. You who came to me in my cell and said there was only one sin left, the willful taking of an innocent human life? Yes, I said. How you must have been laughing at me. I never laughed at you, he said. I cannot afford to laugh at you. It is through you that I can save myself from the despair which I've described to you as our death. It is through you that I must make my link with this 19th century and come to understand it in a way that will revitalize me, which I so desperately need. It is for you that I've been waiting at the Théâtre des Vampires. If I knew a mortal of that sensitivity, that pain, that focus, I would make him a vampire in an instant. But such can rarely be done. No, I've had to wait and watch for you, and now I'll fight for you. Do you see how ruthless I am in love? Is this what you meant by love? Oh, but you'd be making a terrible mistake, I said, looking him in the eyes. His words only slowly sinking in. Never had I felt my all-consuming frustration to be so clear. I could not conceivably satisfy him. I could not satisfy Claudia. I'd never been able to satisfy Lestat. And my own mortal brother Paul, how dismally, mortally I had disappointed him. No, I must make contact with the age, he said to me calmly, and I can do this through you. Not to learn things from you, which I can see in a moment, in an art gallery, or read in an hour, in the thickest of books. You are the spirit, you are the heart, he persisted. No, no, I threw up my hands. I was on the point of a bitter hysterical laughter. Don't you see? I'm not the spirit of any age. I'm at odds with everything, and always have been. I have never belonged anywhere with anyone at any time. It was too painful, too perfectly true. But his face only brightened with an irresistible smile. He seemed on the verge of laughing at me, and then his shoulders began to move with this laughter. But Louis, he said softly, this is the very spirit of your age. Don't you see that? Everyone else feels as you feel. Your fall from grace and faith has been the fall of a century. I was so stunned by this that for a long time I sat there staring into the fire. It had all but consumed the wood and was a wasteland of smoldering ash, a gray and red landscape that would have collapsed at the touch of the poker. Yet it was very warm and still gave off powerful light. I saw my life in complete perspective. And the vampires of the theater? I asked softly. They reflect the age in cynicism, which cannot comprehend the death of possibilities. Fatuous, sophisticated indulgence in the parody of the miraculous, decadence whose last refuge is self-ridicule, a mattered helplessness. You saw them, you've known them all your life. You reflect your age differently. You reflect its broken heart. This is unhappiness. Unhappiness you don't begin to understand. I don't doubt it. Tell me what you feel now. What makes you unhappy? Tell me why for a period of 7 days you haven't come to me, though you were burning to come. Tell me what holds you still to Claudia and the other woman. I shook my head. You don't know what you ask. You see, it was immensely difficult for me to perform the act of making Madeleine into a vampire. I broke a promise to myself that I would never do this, that my own loneliness would never drive me to do it. I don't see our life as powers and gifts. I see it as a curse. I haven't the courage to die, but to make another vampire, to bring this suffering on another, and to condemn to death all those men and women whom that vampire must subsequently kill. I broke a grave promise, and in so doing, but if it's any consolation to you, surely you realize I had a hand in it, that I did it to be free of Claudia, to be free to come to you. Yes, I realize that, but the ultimate responsibility lies with me, I said. No, I mean directly. I made you do it. I was near you the night you did it. I exerted my strongest power to persuade you to do it. Didn't you know this? No, I bowed my head. I would have made this woman a vampire, he said softly, but I thought it best you have a hand in it. Otherwise you would not give up Claudia. You must know you wanted it. I loathe what I did, I said. Then loathe me, not yourself. No, you don't understand. You nearly destroyed the thing you value in me when this happened. I resisted you with all my power when I didn't even know it was your force, which was working on me. Something nearly died in me. Passion nearly died in me. I was all but destroyed when Madeleine was created. But that thing is no longer dead, that passion, that humanity, whatever you wish to name it. If it were not alive, there wouldn't be tears in your eyes now. There wouldn't be rage in your voice, he said. For the moment I couldn't answer. I only nodded. Then I struggled to speak again. You must never force me to do something against my will. You must never exert such power. I stammered. No, he said at once. "I must not. My power stops somewhere inside you. At some threshold, there I am powerless. However, this creation of Madeleine is done. You are free." "And you are satisfied?" I said, gaining control of myself. "I don't mean to be harsh. You have me. I love you. But I'm mystified. You're satisfied?" "How could I not be?" he asked. "I am satisfied, of course."